whole world is sick.
Are you worried about America? I am.
Believe the impossible and you can do the incredible.
Well, welcome to the Catholic Patriot. Wow, I have got a great one with us today. He's been a friend of our show for, gosh, I guess since it began, and I've been very blessed to have him as a personal friend. Really admire all the work that he's done, and just to see what God's done in, gosh, less than, I don't know how many years it's been now, but probably about 10 years. What I love about our guests is he brings a very fresh perspective on things that you don't really hear on the news that we need to. And there's, as you know, most of the things that are going on in the world right now, it's a massive information war. What is the truth? What isn't the truth? What isn't even being talked about? What's being neglected? And I think Jason, more than anyone that I know of, has been somebody who's been a voice of the neglected. And as Fulton Sheen reminded us so often, the greatest sins that we face and what crucifies our Lord today more than anything is apathy, indifference, neglect. So it's a great honor to welcome back to our podcast, Jason Jones of the Vulnerable People Project. Jason, welcome.
Peter, it's great to see you, brother.
It's always good to see you, and you're always busy. So I know that just to get you on for any amount of time is something really precious, and I hope to make the most of it. You know, just looking at things this morning, just to jump right into things. Of course, I get your emails from the Vulnerable People Project, and because I'm always, I'm trying to get the broader picture. Like, I focus on the things that are obvious and more important, and making sure I have the right understanding, the truth of the narrative. But then there's so many other, I don't want to use the word chessboards out there, but there's so many other things going on that not only do we not know of, but we should be made aware of. And I've expressed my frustration to you in the past that we don't simply hear about the things that you talk about hardly on any other media outlet, especially Catholic ones. You know, LifeSite News, just to give them a shout out, they deserve all the praise that they can get on that, because they've given you a platform to be a voice for the vulnerable. And just this morning, and then even a couple of days ago, I don't know of anybody who's talking about what's going on in Syria, for example. So before we even jump into that, let me just throw this out there, because I want to forget. Because one of the things that's on here, this is a kind of a context, is I want everyone to get your book. I have it on order, and I'm probably going to use more the Audible version, since I'm very kind of ADD when it comes to reading and writing. But I'm pretty familiar with the contents, because I've also listened to you talk about it on other platforms. But tell us about your book, because it really does frame the battle that we're in right now. It's called, I'm going to put on the screen here, The Great Campaign Against the Great Reset. Why did you write it? Why is it important? And then I want to kind of use that as a platform to springboard into the things that I want to talk about, what's going on in America, and then the broader picture.
Yeah, sure, Peter. Well, thank you very much. It would make a wonderful Christmas present. And I really wrote it for young people, but what is it? Necessity is the mother of invention. So why did I write this book? It was not something I had on my mind to write. I signed this is family, right? This is our family, Fulton Sheen podcast family. And so I'm going to tell you the story, the whole story. I signed a contract to write my spiritual autobiography for Sophia Press, which will be coming out next year. And the title is On Rocky Soil, And the subtitle is A Spiritual Autobiography from a Man You May Not Meet in Heaven. It's kind of like a Father James Shaw title, at least in length. And what I'd been asked for many years from several publishers to write an autobiography, which I thought was silly because I'm so young and really haven't accomplished much. Well, I'm 53. To me, I'm young. If you're 25, I'm very old. And if you're 80, I'm very young. But I thought I haven't accomplished much. And what would I really have to say to anyone that's of value? But I did, I listened to my dear friend Eric Metaxas's autobiography, Fish Out of Water, which is absolutely amazing. And you should listen to it on Audible, not buy it. And Sophia Press asked me if I had any books in the hopper. I had 4, none of them being this book. And I had a 5th I didn't mention, which was the one on rocky soil. But I didn't think Sophia would want it. So I pitched them 4 books and they kind of yawned. And I thought they were great ideas, and I'm working on them actually, but they yawned. And then I said, well, I have another one. They have anything else? I said, yes, but you're not going to want it. And I told them what it was. And they said, well, why wouldn't we want it? We love the title. And I said, well, because it's going to be pretty raw. I mean, it's going to be very raw. It's not, I love Scott Hahn and I love Rome Sweet Home. But when I read it as a young atheist, it didn't speak to me at all. So I thought I wanted to write sort of a Rome Sweet Home from someone who was rocky soil, and I mean that in all sincerity, that I work out my salvation with fear and trembling. And I acknowledge that I am in that parable, rocky soil. But of course, grace builds upon nature and God can turn those rocks into stepping stones. But it's pretty raw. I signed the contract. I said to Sophia, listen, guys, Afghanistan is in full collapse. This was August of the year of the collapse. I said, Afghanistan is in full collapse. It's going to take me about a month to evacuate some Afghans, and then I'll get on the book. So give me a year. Well, I'm still in Afghanistan. You know what I mean? So, and then Afghanistan was a much harder job than I thought. And it didn't rock my faith, but I became despondent and maybe a dark night of the soul. Did not feel like writing that book and kept kicking the can down the road with Sophia, but I owed them a book. In June of 2023, not that long ago, I was in Ukraine and I was in Kyiv. Among the many things I was there to do was to meet with Zelensky and his senior staff and speak to elected officials and pro-life and Catholic and Orthodox leaders. And they took me to visit a hospital that had been a former Soviet prison. It was the second largest building I had ever been in my life, the largest being the Pentagon, which is the largest building in the room. And as I went room to room to room, and in every room, there was at least 3 boys missing arms, legs, and eyes. Some boys were missing their arms, their legs, and their eyes. One room I went, a man with no arms or no legs had his newborn child placed on his chest. And General Milley's words rang through my ear. He was asked a few months after, sorry for the long answer, a few months after the invasion began, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, if he thought Ukraine could win. And Milley said, we don't need them to win. All we need is a quagmire. Our goal is a quagmire. And I thought, this is what a quagmire looks like. I've heard similar rhetoric around the civil war erupting in Syria today, that our goal is that neither side wins and that both sides inflict as much damage on each other as possible. Of course, right now, today, Christians and Kurds and Yazidis are being beheaded, murdered and raped. That's what a quagmire looks like. And in Ukraine, what a quagmire looked like was room after room after room after room after room, blocks of rooms, block after block in this massive building of boys without arms, without legs, without eyes. And it dawned on me, this is the Great Reset. This is what we're talking about. And those of you're listening to this, you understand Fulton Sheen. This is the battle of the mystical body of Christ versus the mystical body of Antichrist. And if I wanted just well-formed Catholics to read my book, that would have been the title, because that's a more accurate description of what the book is. It's about the battle that is raging right now between the mystical body of Christ and the mystical body of Antichrist. And what is the Great Reset? What is the goal of Antichrist? It's to deny victims of defenders. It's to empty, to delete from the West the memory of the truth about the dignity of the human person, our anthropological origin, what we are, creatures made in the image and likeness of God. It's war, it's genocide, it's democide, it's poverty, it's famine, it's tyranny. And so for those of us in the West, the Great Reset is like a boogeyman that's around the corner. But the reality is the boogeyman is here. Wars are raging. Israel is bombing our churches, starving Christians in the West Bank, in Gaza, brutalizing Christians in the West Bank. Azerbaijan ethnically cleansed an entire Christian community of 120,000 Christians last year. India, the Hindu nationalists are waging a brutal war against the church in India. In one province alone, 280 churches out of 340 were destroyed, and the CCP is waging a relentless war on the church, with 12 Catholic bishops disappeared and countless thousand laymen killed and imprisoned. We see in Syria right now this civil war that's erupting before our very eyes. It's a reboot of what ISIS did in Iraq and Syria 10 years ago. By the way, I was there on the ground documenting it, and I hope to be back on the ground in Syria with the Kurds in the coming weeks. In Nigeria, 9 out of 10 martyrs last year in the world were in Nigeria. In Sudan, there may be 1 million killed in the civil war erupting in India, in Sudan this year. This is what the Great Reset looks like. This is what the Great Reset is. This is what the battle between the mystical body of Christ and the mystical body of Antichrist writes. So why did I write this book? It was really, I became just focused and enraged. And I called the publisher, I called Sophia Press from Ukraine, and I pitched them this book. I thought I was going to have to twist their arm. And as soon as they heard the title, they said, that's a great book, but we want it like in 6 months. And so I hired a team of the best researchers for each of the core chapters, the best and the brightest in the world on each of the ideologies of evil from all over the world. And we went to town in pushing this book out. It's been so well received. Turning Point USA purchased 50,000 copies for their students. And I have been told that it's at sort of a higher academic level. We really tried to make it accessible to everyone. And I think it is accessible to everyone, especially if you watch the Fulton Sheen show. You'll see a lot of Fulton Sheen in this book. But yeah, that was the source of this book. It was birthed by my outrage at the sight of young Ukrainian boys in a hospital.
Wow.
Sorry for the long answer.
No. Well, you did exactly what I was hoping, because as I was mentioning in the beginning, it's sort of like this time with you is sort of a walk around the world, or a skip around the world with Jason Jones and the Vulnerable People Project, because of you have a bunch of things that we're battling. One is the narrative, the truth. We've all been kind of brainwashed, and I find this probably more among Catholics than I do anyone else, is there has to be a side that's chosen of you're either with Israel or you're against, or you're for the terrorists or Hamas, or you're either for Ukraine or you're against it, and if you are, then you're pro-Russian. But all of these things are very complex. Because you have the Great Reset is all about powers orchestrating what they want through the world, and they don't care who suffers. Well, actually, they do, because it's really the Great Reset is also the Great Replacement. We now see that in the immigration problems everywhere. And it gets so muddled because when you want to address the issue, it's like if you speak anything against these things, they already have a label waiting for you. you're anti-immigrant or you're anti-Semitic if you have issues with the genocide that's being caused by Israel. Like de facto, their own generals come out and say people in Palestinian Strip, Gaza, they have no right to existence. Like this isn't like speculation. You could actually watch these clips. These people do that, and then you see that happening. I had a person, a wonderful person, that was saying, "Well, look, you're talking about ethnic cleansing in Gaza, but the Christians and especially the Catholics are like less than maybe 1%." I said, "Well, when does percentage matter for anything?"
And I'm glad you brought that up. But they were 72% prior to 1948. So, so the ethnic cleansing and the cleansing of Christians has been successful. Like right now in northern Gaza, that's where the Christians live. The battle is relentless. The cleansing. These are civilians. They've completely surrounded. We lost the logistics manager who was trying to bring aid in. He was killed by the IDF, trying to bring aid in to the Christians. They're starving to death. And these are my brothers and sisters in Christ. But by the way, I also care about the Muslim women and children. And you know what the first thing VPP did on October 7th? The very, very first thing. I was outraged and I was horrified. I was worried about copycat attacks on Jews. The first thing we did, and I won't say the country, but we greenlit a massive expense for our little organization, putting security cameras and security guards outside of synagogues in a country where the synagogues were at risk of attack. Our Catholic apostolate did this. So our Catholic apostolate defends Christians and Jews and Muslims and Uyghurs and others. I don't look to see if you've been circumcised or baptized.
Mm-hmm.
And no, so you're right. There's always a label waiting. I'm in Ukraine. Our VPP evacuated Ukrainians as fast as we could, bought fleets of trucks, thanks to LifeSite News in part, and began delivering insulin and doing evacuations as soon as Russia invaded, of orphans from the east, bringing them to the west. I went to Ukraine during the war. I went wearing a Ukrainian military shirt. Yet I was advocating for a ceasefire the whole time. Because I advocated for a ceasefire, people said I was pro-Russian. I said, Ukraine can't win this war. They're being used as an instrument of Germany and the United States and the NATO powers to achieve their quote unquote perceived interests. And we don't do evil that good would come of it. And just as every person is a means to they're an end in themselves, every nation of people is an end in themselves. Israel doesn't exist to serve our interests. It exists for the people that live there. Same thing for the people in Gaza, the people in Lebanon, the people in Syria, people in Ukraine. They're not instruments to our interests, but this is how the foreign policy establishment behaves. And we can get into Syria because if you want to pick a side, it starts to get very confusing if you want to be a well-formed, thoughtful Catholic. So, but I'm in Ukraine, serving Ukrainians, but because I'm called for a ceasefire day one, I went to Ukraine and met with the leadership and begged for a ceasefire. Well, now Zelensky's come out and said, we're ready to offer a deal that means that we would cede some territory. This was always inevitable. It was inevitable a million lives ago, a million casualties ago. Why did we have to go through all of this to come to what any thoughtful person, General Milley, knew? The brainwashed masses, they whip you up, you buy in. But General Milley was very clear. The best we could hope for was a very long quagmire. They got their 1 million casualties. The military-industrial complex cashed those checks. Now they've moved to the Middle East. I'd like to talk about Syria because most folks listening today may not even know about what's happening in Syria. For example, the Drudge Report hasn't even covered it. CNN covers it and the mainstream media covers it in a very dishonest way. They say freedom fighters or rebels are waging a war of liberation against Assad. No. ISIS affiliated and Al-Qaeda affiliated organizations, and I say affiliated for those who are scrupulous. These are interconnected organizations. Al-Qaeda, Yemen, congratulated the Al-Qaeda affiliates in Syria for their success. Okay. These are vicious, brutal, Islamists, okay? And they're waging a war against the minorities in Aleppo as we speak. 500,000 Kurds, the Yazidis back at risk. My organization served the Yazidis 10 years ago during the genocide, and it has been heartbreaking to receive messages from women that we had cared for during and after the last war and genocide. Now they're panicked and frightful for their family and friends again. Well, what side is the United States on? I'm going to ask those who, many of you know this, but some of you who don't are going to just shut me out. You're going to tune me out. And I love you. I thank you for giving me this opportunity. Our intelligence community, our intelligence agencies are backing the Islamist groups. They're backing ISIS affiliates. They're backing Al-Qaeda affiliates. Jake Sullivan has come out and publicly said, Al-Qaeda in Syria is on our side. Okay, Al-Qaeda killed Americans. Has Assad ever killed an American? ISIS has waged wars of ethnic cleansing and genocide against the oldest Christian communities in the world. Assad has defended those communities from ISIS.
Exactly.
Our intelligence agencies are backing them for our interest. Well, what is our interest? Well, I think here's the clue. The Department of Defense, CENTCOM, the U.S. Air Force, is bombing the CIA affiliates, the CIA instruments. So this doesn't seem to make sense until you realize, you think back to General Milley's quote about a quagmire. You can go back to what Henry Kissinger said during the Iran-Iraq War when he was asked, who do we want to win? You remember when the United States gave chemical weapons to Saddam Hussein to use against Kurds and Iranians? Okay. What did Henry Kissinger say? Henry Kissinger said, I want them both to lose. So what did he mean? He wanted Iraqi boys and Iranian boys to lose their arms, to lose their eyes. Look, I'm a veteran of the infantry, as is my son who fought in Iraq and Syria. My father, my grandfather, all infantrymen, my brother, an infantryman, also fought in Iraq. So I know the cost of war on families. And I'm a Christian man. I'm a patriot. I love my country. That's why I want my country to behave nobly. And I don't think it is in our long-term interest, and it's definitely not in the eternal interests of our policymakers, to use whole nations as instruments to achieve our perceived interests, because our elite have demonstrated they have never understood what's in the best interest of the American people. That's why Trump is walking in the White House. So what is going on in Syria is the United States would like to see Islamists and Assad and Iran and Russia drawn into a quagmire where they pummel each other to death. Okay, Islamists and Russian soldiers and Syrian soldiers fighting, that's one thing. But what's in the middle of all of this? Families, villages, communities, children, women being trafficked, being raped, being beheaded, being abused. And so what does this have to do with this? Is a Catholic apostolate show. Bishop Fulton Sheen wrote a great book about the world at war. He wrote eloquently on war. In fact, he rose to prominence because of his wartime talks. This was a man that was engaged in the real world battles. And it is not enough for his Catholic lay men and women to sit back in the back seat and tell the rest of the world to take us for a ride. And there's a lot of the rise of Catholic integralism, which I've been a critic of. I'm like, what are you waiting for, you integralists? You're already a priest, prophet, and king. You're already an American citizen with access to wealth and technology and influence and power. And what we should be doing as Catholics that are sovereigns in a constitutional republic is we should be living out our citizenship in an honorable and noble way. And when our quote unquote elite are harnessing the wealth and the military might and power of our country to pummel and brutalize the most vulnerable people in the world, when our corporations are using Catholic children in Congo to harvest cobalt for electric vehicles and solar panels and cell phones, working children to death, when American corporations are using Uyghur slave labor made products from Chinese occupied East Turkestan to enrich themselves, then what is the role of the Catholic layman? Our role, the Paraclete, is the defender Satan is the accuser. We are to defend the vulnerable, to stand with them. And know it'll always come at a cost. It's not easy to stand against multinational corporations to defend the children of Congo. It's not easy to stand up against multinational corporations, the Chinese Communist Party, to advocate for the Uyghur. Who are the Uyghur to you, to anybody? Who cares, right? Or the Yazidi, a pre-Abrahamic religion, the most powerless people on earth, that today, again, are going to be slaughtered. Where is the voice of the Catholic layman in the world? Where are we? We're silent when our own co-religionists were cleansed during ISIS 10 years ago. We were silent as Israel bombed 8 churches in the past 3 weeks in Lebanon, as bombing and starving the Christian community of northern Gaza, as robbing and brutalizing the Catholics in the West Bank. Our government is fomenting a war in Syria that's immolating one of the oldest Christian communities in the world in Syria. And a lot of you people don't even understand that Syria and Iraq and Jordan and Palestine, these are Christian peoples, Christian nations with a 2,000-year Christian tradition. I would love to bring everyone with me on my trips to see how beautiful and rich these Christian communities in the Middle East are. And yet a prominent Catholic journalist told me that I was off base in advocating for the Christians in Palestine because they weren't really Christians after all. They were Arabs. Well, there were Arabs in the upper room. I'm English, Scottish, and Norwegian. None of us were in the upper room when the church was founded. They've been there since the church was founded. And the Palestinians are descendants of the Jews that accepted Jesus. If I can't stand with them, who in the world can I stand with? Nobody. No, I won't stand with any Christian. If I'm not going to stand with the descendants of the apostles' families because a little bit of a propaganda. I had a priest ask me, brother, he said, I would like to advocate for the Palestinians, but I'm not doing it because I'm afraid of being called an anti-Semite. I'm like, well, if you won't stand with the Palestinians because you're afraid of being called an anti-Semite, would you have stood with the Jews in 1941 in Germany and Poland? Because they would have done more than call you a filio-Semite. They would have murdered you. So I tell you what, I know it's only by God's grace that we have the strength to stand up to the spirit of the age, but we should all beg God for the grace to do that. Because this is something I've been saying, and I'm going to write an open letter to President Trump in a couple of weeks, the week before Christmas, that I am fearful that this is going to be the last Christmas for Christians in Bethlehem. And it'll most definitely be, it's the last Christmas for Christians in northern Gaza. And what are we going to do about that? Are we going to stop that from happening? Can you imagine in the 2,000-year history of the church, the mystical body of Christ moving around the world, that this could be the last Christmas in Bethlehem? All because American evangelical Christians and English in the Anglosphere have been brainwashed into a heresy, actually an apostasy, that is Christian Zionism. And then Catholics who consume evangelical heretical material hold to these absurd apostasies and heresies like Christian Zionism, which denies that Jesus is the fulfillment of every promise to Abraham, which denies that we are the new Israel. Scripture, the New Testament couldn't be more clear on this. There is no longer Jew or Gentile. There is no longer Jew. And I want to be clear, anti-Semitism is repugnant and despicable and should be rejected. But our fear of that virulent, hateful bigotry shouldn't be an excuse to be silent to what's happening to Arabs. Because in full disclosure, I don't have an anti-Semitic bone in my body. I grew up with Jewish friends and going to bar mitzvahs, but I have in my life had to wrestle my way out of an anti-Arab prejudice. I have struggled with this, not even knowing that I struggled with this. And I would guess it's true for you, sir, and it's true for most of us watching, because we've been inculcated in a bigotry. And it ain't anti-Semitism. So we should check our prejudices Our bigotry, our prejudices really just tell us about ourselves. We shouldn't be in our community and our society. We shouldn't beat ourselves up over it. We go, oh, that's interesting. How did that come about? Why am I more upset about 100 dead Israeli children than 20,000 dead Palestinian children? Why does one strike me different than the other? Why? Let me think about it. So sorry for this long rant, but it is a challenging time. And because most of us watching this, you're American Catholics, you have the severe burden of being a citizen of the most powerful country in the history of the world. And although we have an elite that seeks to keep our hands and fingers off of the instruments of power, the truth is, if we're relentless and thoughtful, we can influence the way our great nation state behaves. And we have a severe duty to do so. We're not just in the passenger seat. I am most definitely not content with being in the passenger seat. I want us in the driver's seat and throwing who's been driving out the vehicle.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting as you're talking, my mind went right to the Declaration of Independence, and there's that one line of when a long line of abuses and usurpations, such and such, it is our duty to throw off such government. I really think that that's the moment that came this past November, and yet, as you're talking, the questions that come to my mind that I think should always come to every person's mind, every citizen's mind, but especially Catholics, is, well, we did that in a certain sense. We made a statement. I see it as, whether they realize it or not, they are rejecting what the Great Reset is about as it applies to America, because the Great Reset has different levels. You've got immigration, you've got replacement, you've got, eventually it's just full-blown communism over everything, complete control. Everybody's a subhuman, and population control. I mean, it just goes across the board, clash of civilizations, for their own purposes, because the technological elite is the only thing that's going to remain, a scientific elite. But we have a victory, and then you're talking about the threats that we have that many people don't quite understand, because they are afraid of the labels of, for example, being anti-Semitic. But you mentioned Christian Zionism. A lot of people don't even know what Zionism is. And maybe you can summarize that for us very briefly. And then you did talk about Christian Zionism. On top of that, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, I guess, I gave you a kind of a frustrating text, and then you called me. We were talking about just a little bit. And my concern was, why does it look like these people who are very sympathetic or are very open about that this is the same platform that they support, like an Israel first over anything else, and unapologetically, like, at all costs, they're our brother, we will come to them and rescue them, that these are the people that are surrounding President Trump coming in. I mean, Secretary of State, a Catholic, Marco Rubio, might be the most blatant of them all. But you kind of go right through the list and you see all, I saw a great little 5-minute summary, basically, of how many have received tons of money from Israel, or they're involved in the AI pacts, and you listen to what they're saying, and it's very frightening, because these are policy makers. You have the people on the ground like you, and you can say the Mother Teresas, the Francis Cabrinis, which, as a parenthesis, as you were talking, today, as we're recording this, is the feast of Saint Francis Xavier. We need Teresas of Calcutta's out there who can go to the poorest and the poor, the vulnerable. And then we also need the Francis Xaviers out there who went out and tried to literally convert the top people of power to the Christian ethic, to the gospel. We need both of them. But anyway, just going back, like, it seems that the infiltration is already very strong. And in light of the work that you're doing, and the work that more Catholics need to be engaged in, like you're saying, having more boots on the ground and helping them, it seems like we're setting ourselves up right now. And I don't know where Trump's going to go, but he's surrounded by people who are all part of that mentality, not in little ways, massive ways. What are your thoughts about where our country is right now moving forward into that? Are you concerned about that? Am I overreacting to that? What do you think Trump is thinking about that? And you have
I'm very concerned about that. I was just asked on another show if I was hopeful or not. I said, I didn't want to be a Debbie Downer. And so at the domestic level, I'm extremely hopeful. I'm excited that the J6 defendants will be pardoned. I hope they better be. I'm hopeful that these pro-lifers and these Catholics who have suffered at the hands of a weaponized Department of Justice will be freed and exonerated. I'm excited about that. I'm excited that our children and our fellow citizens won't be persecuted for not taking experimental vaccines and treated as lab rats. And I'm excited that DEI is going to be purged from our military. And I am the one thing that I know about Donald Trump, that I love about Donald Trump, is the man's repulsed by violence and war. Just repulsed by
yeah.
it. Even in his early interviews, what I always found striking about him in the late 90s when he was saying he was pro-choice, you could tell he was repulsed by abortion, because when everyone brought up the topic, he would put his hands up like this and go, I hate it. I don't want to talk about it. When he talks about war, he gets exasperated and he hates it. And Trump, in many ways, he's not a foreign policy wonk. So when Trump says that Israel's our best friend and I love Israel and Israel is beautiful people, he means it. He's very sincere. And then he'll turn around in the next breath and say, why are we killing Iranians? I would hate to see Iranians killed. You remember, and he said it a couple of weeks ago, Iran's a beautiful country. Nothing would break my heart more than to see bombs falling on Iran. It was very sincere. This is a man who doesn't believe, and I agree with him on this, that caring for the citizens of Tel Aviv and caring for the citizens of Gaza, you can do both, which we do both. Also, I'm not going to weaponize history. I think political Zionism is cockamamie. It's insane. But at the same time, all the borders in the Middle East are cockamamie. They're insane. You look at the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and you had the Western powers, specifically France and Britain, and then to a lesser extent, Russia, redesign the borders of the Middle East to serve their interests in a way that made no sense. So when my Muslim friends from the Middle East want to talk about Israel being a fake country, I'm going to say, well, really, tell me about Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Iraq and Syria and the borders there. How do those borders come about? And I don't want to weaponize history. I say that our ancestors left us plenty of landmines. Why don't we remove the landmines and plant olive trees? And I don't want to turn this into where do we go from here in Israel? Is it a two-state solution, which I do support? And I do support, broadly speaking, what I call a cantonization of the Middle East. I don't think we should change national boundaries. And maybe this is too far afield for the podcast, but to me, it makes sense as a conservative thought for the well-being of the people who live there, for the interests of the people who live there, not the perceived interests of the United States or Google or Facebook or the CIA, but for the people who live there. I think that what we can do is empower the minority communities where they live, the way Switzerland empowers its cantons. That's why I call it cantonization. Switzerland in the 19th century was actually a very violent country, racked with strife. You had different religions, different ethnicities, different languages. And so what they did is really that most of the power in Switzerland lies in the canton. So let's cantonize the Middle East. Let the great powers, the United States, Germany, UK, Russia, China, behave like adults and humans and be partners with smaller powers, rather than all of us competing on how we can leverage these poor, broken countries to achieve our interests. And a foreign policy realist would say I'm naive, but this is what a Christian in the public life is called to do. To be salt and light, to raise the bar, not sink to the level of where the bar is. So as a Catholic, as a Christian, my concern is for our family, the human family. Of course, starting first with the people who live under my roof and in my community and in my nation. But that doesn't give me the right to be thoughtless. I want to drag in another issue that I have great concern. My development director said, And I run a nonprofit, and for those not in the nonprofit world, a development director, that's the person that begs for you, right? That's the fundraiser. And my development director, she's like, you are the hardest person to work for. You got to keep throwing curveballs at me, because what has my organization done this month? And we're going to greatly increase our work at the border. Now, why is the Vulnerable People Project increasing our work at the border? We're working with a network of pregnancy centers on the Mexican and on the American side of the border that serves pregnant migrants and women with toddlers and young toddler-age children. That's it. Why? Because I suspect it's about to get a little chaotic around the immigration issue in this country. And there's two things that I want to do in the midst of this. I have been advocating border security before it was popular. I have a book coming out called Dispatches from the Great Campaign from Sophia Press. For 20 years, I've been writing articles saying, secure the border, mandatory e-verification. And why? Because I don't want, number one, vulnerable Americans to see their wages undercut and the system's burden that's there to serve them. And number two, I don't want to see vulnerable migrants lured into a dangerous underground economy and exploited. And we have an obligation to protect vulnerable migrants and vulnerable Americans. But there's sort of this rule of law, the migrants don't matter, that denies the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation is we had an open border by design. Wall Street and the Chamber of Commerce by design didn't want legal migrants, they wanted illegal migrants to exploit. And so our economy's rested on the exploitation of migrants. And now, praise God, I pray we're going to fix that. But I hope the vulnerable in the middle of all of that are protected. So my development director is like, this is going to confuse a lot of our people because they're not going to get it. I'm like, well, I don't need people supporting my organization that don't get that those Catholic young women coming across the border with a baby in their hand because they have been promised a job and a future. I don't want them drowning or dying of pneumonia. I have pneumonia right now. It's not fun. And I'm in a beautiful warm house drinking coffee, warm, coming to you from my garage instead of my office. But we want to use this opportunity of the coming crisis to exemplify the truth and dignity of the migrant and our obligation to care for the vulnerable. And caring for the vulnerable doesn't end at the end of my nose or at the end of my family, at the end of my block, at the end of my nation. I'm part of the Universal Church. I'm a Catholic running a Catholic apostolate. And like Fulton Sheen, his wonderful rosary. By the way, your rosary, everyone should get your rosary. It is my favorite rosary.
Well, that's awesome. Glad.
It is my favorite rosary. It is my new rosary I travel with. I used to use my old Army rosary. It's made of 550 cord, but I've been so sick of war and violence. I told my wife I'm purging myself of all my veteran paraphernalia. I don't even want to think of war. Even with my rosary, it had a 550 cord and Ranger beads. I loved it, but now I'm tired of it. And your rosaries replaced that. But it's Fulton Sheen's rosary where we prayed for the world. We're called to evangelize the world. As a citizen of the United States, I have a responsibility for the interests of my country. But that doesn't give me the right to be immoral. As a father, I am responsible for the interests of my family. But that doesn't mean I can steal from my neighbor and beat his kids. You know what I mean? And so I want to be a good father, a member of my family. I want to represent my family with honor and dignity. I want my country to present itself with honor and dignity, not live off the exploitation of the weak, thoughtless to how our policies destroy the most vulnerable. And then when my country's behavior is undermining my church, the Church of Jesus Christ, nah. Well, then I'm standing with the church. When American planes flown by Israelis are dropping 2,000-pound bombs on Catholic churches in Gaza, which has happened the past 12 months, bombing churches in Lebanon, well, which side am I on there? Well, that's very easy. Mm-hmm. I'm on the side of the people praying the rosary. I'm on the side of the descendants of the apostles, their families, who their families shared the gospel of Jesus Christ with their neighbors, who shared it with their neighbors, and it finally reached my family running around Scandinavia and the British Isles acting a wild, which we still do. Didn't stick long. Didn't stick long with my people, with our people. I mean, I think 3% of Scandinavian countries now go to church. 3%.
Yeah, it's really bad.
Yeah. So again, sorry for the long rant, but I just think we as Catholics should be inoculate ourselves to the propaganda of the world. And a simple rule that I stand by is I stand with the most vulnerable person in the room. And the more confused and confusing the circumstances, the more I'm going to stand with the weak. Because it's the powerful that have an interest in muddling the facts when they're unjust. When they're just, I think they would have an interest in speaking very clearly and the ability to present the facts very clearly. So when powerful people say, well, it's really complicated why we're starving civilians. It's very complicated why 20,000 children have died in Gaza over the past. It's very complicated why we're finding infants with 80 bullets in their body in Gaza. It's very complicated why child after child has been double tapped. That means they have 1, 2, 3, 4 sniper rounds in their head. Very complex. Nah, I don't think that's complicated at all. And I think your fear, a lot of people watching this show, I guarantee it, that consume Protestant media, read books like by Jonathan Cahn, and there's locked over. There's people who love your show, love Fulton Sheen, and somehow read books like by guys like Jonathan Cahn, who is his book will one day be in a genocide museum that completely empties the Palestinians of any worth and dignity. The people that say that they don't understand what's happening in Gaza, they're afraid to know the truth, so they just don't look. It would take you about 8 seconds on Google to get the facts, take you 4.3 seconds on ChatGPT. And then, God forbid, follow me on Instagram and you will not escape the images of the war, because I flood my Instagram with images of the war. And yeah. And I think this is what Fulton Sheen would be doing today. What I loved so much about Bishop Fulton Sheen is he addressed the real problems that people were facing at that time. Even in the midst of like my favorite book of his, The World's First Love, you know, he's still battling against totalitarian socialism in a book on Our Blessed Mother. And I think we can do the both. And what's interesting about my organization, we do not seek to apostatize. We do not seek to evangelize. But it's unbelievable how many people through our organization have come into the Catholic Church simply because we love and protect them. And we don't hide that we're Catholic, but you know, we're not rescuing people from a country and then, you know, handing them tracts on the way out.
Yeah.
But they know who we are. They know we're Catholic. We're very open about that in all of our communications and what we do. But yeah, that's why for me, Fulton Sheen, St. Maximilian Kolbe, they were so animated with joy, the love and use of technology and media, but they never averted their eyes from the real problems. Maximilian Kolbe was called an anti-Semite throughout his whole career. Then he dies in Auschwitz. And then again, Zionist organizations opposed his canonization, saying he was an anti-Semite. And why do they say he was an anti-Semite? Because he was very critical of certain Jews in Poland at the time that were the pornographers, and he called them out on it. He expressed clearly what the problems with Zionism were, political Zionism, and his whole priesthood was consecrated to the conversion of Jews. And that is seen by those who hold to Christian Zionism as anti-Semitic. Our desire to convert Jews, you will have evangelical Christian Zionists say that our goal, our desire that Jews would come to Christ is anti-Semitic. Although scripture couldn't be more clear that Jesus came for the Jew first, then us. How in the world would I want to hide Christ from the Jews? I think hiding Christ from the Jews because I'm afraid of being called anti-Semitic is cowardice and anti-Semitism, actually. I've had Jewish friends become Christian, and that to me is beautiful. I love it, and it's been wonderful for them. One of my dear friends, he's not Catholic. This was 25 years ago. We got in a big battle. He was an atheist, and I was really harsh on him. And I told him to move to Israel and study the Torah. And then when he was thoroughly thought he knew the Torah, I would like him to come back to Hawaii, and I would like to share with him Jesus. But God moved faster than me. While he did quit his job, he moved to Israel. On his way to Israel, he came to my wedding, which was in Rome at the time. We were married in Rome. At the altar where Our Lady appeared to Ratisbon.
Oh, you were married right there? San Andrea de la Frate?
My wife and I are the only wedding they've allowed there since Our Lady appeared. Why they allowed it, I didn't even know I was asking anything special.
Oh my goodness, I didn't know
We're
that.
the only marriage that happened since Our Lady appeared, probably for Elijah. I'll tell you what happened. So my buddy Elijah, he's Jewish from India. We got in a big fight, like hardcore fight on theology and religion. And when he ends up, I say, quit your job, move to Israel, study the Torah, then come home, then I'll tell you about Jesus. So he goes to Israel. He's on his way to Israel. He comes to my wedding. The altar where St. Maximilian Kolbe celebrated his first mass.
Mm-hmm.
Chose that altar because Our Lady appeared there to Ratisbon. And Maximilian Kolbe wanted to consecrate his priesthood to the conversion of Jews and Masons. And I wanted to consecrate my marriage to defending the vulnerable through media. And so that just seemed like the perfect place for us to get married. We got married and we presented roses to Our Lady at the end, asking her to use us, to immolate us, to crush us in the service of the weak and the vulnerable. Well, Elijah was there at San Andrea della Frate. I remember looking going, oh, brother, our Lord's going to get you. He goes to Israel and he gets repulsed by what he's learning in this school. Utterly repulsed, especially by the racism and he was a Jew from India. So to kind of hear sort of the anti-Arab bigotry, things he was hearing. And one thing led to another. Now he has one of the biggest Messianic Jewish congregations in the world. And so he's a Christian, but he's a part of the Messianic movement. He was a different man before and after Jesus. He was not confident. He kind of partied a lot and surfed. This was in Hawaii. He was very smart. He worked for Konami, developing video games. And he was one of these, we all have friends. We think there's no way they're ever coming to Christ. I don't know if I lack faith, Lord, sometimes with some people. He was one of them, definitely one of them. But I think Fulton Sheen and St. Maximilian Kolbe, because, they lived in modernity. They lived in times like ours, tragically like ours. So they're very good models. They're for us to look to see how we live our personal apostolate in this tragic world. But Fulton Sheen was called lots of things and suffered persecution from the hierarchy even then. And St. Maximilian Kolbe was called an anti-Semite. He died in Auschwitz. He landed in Auschwitz for writing anti-Nazi newspaper and hiding Jews in his monastery, yet was called an anti-Semite. G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc were two of the loudest defenders of Jews in Europe with the rise of the Nazis during the 30s. But in the 20s, because they opposed political Zionism, they had been called anti-Semites. Fulton, and one of the last essays that Chesterton wrote said it's strange how the last two anti-Semites in Europe, Hilaire Belloc and G.K. Chesterton, became the last two defenders of the Jews. And those of us who have the courage to stand up for the Palestinians in the midst of this violent contagion, we will be the ones that stand with the Jews in the midst of a different violent contagion that's inevitable. That's what it is to be a Catholic. It's to stand with the scapegoat. It's to be like John. We will see our fellow Catholics swept away. Poor John was there alone. Peter swept away. Everyone swept away. René Girard says, those of us who aren't swept away, it's only grace. And just because we weren't swept away in this contagion doesn't mean the devil, who's a judo master, might not get us in the next contagion. So we should pray for the grace and the courage to always stand with the vulnerable, regardless of whatever that cost is. And we may have new challenges in the Trump administration. Because I can promise you, if this war in Gaza doesn't end, I will be standing up.
Mhm.
I'll be louder than I have been the past 12 months, and I've been loud. Because MAGA movement was built on a revulsion to war. And President Trump promised us that he would end these wars. And we should demand that. That was a promise that was made. Very severe promise. I went and campaigned across Pennsylvania for him, mobilizing the Middle Eastern Christian community for him, specifically the Syrian Christian community. And now the Syrian Christian community needs President Trump to stand with them. They exist in their own right. The Christians in Syria are not merely roadblocks or instruments to America's interests or Israel's interests or Russia's interests or Iran's interests. They live where their ancestors have lived since the time of Christ. We are the most powerful country in the world, a Christian nation. We should stand with them. We should protect them. We don't need to go to war to defend them. We need to stop fomenting wars. I'm not saying that our boys need to parachute in to Syria. I'm saying we need to stop fomenting Islamist extremism. We need to stop weaponizing extremist organizations. We need to stop regime changes. And we need to be advocates of peace and order.
Amen. And we need to wake up. We need to know what the truth is. The whole purpose of you writing the book is to help synthesize that for people, because once it's like we live in a time where, and we use, a kingdom of Christ versus kingdom of Antichrist. It's another way of looking at it too, is looking at what is the truth and what is a counterfeit. Those who work in the FBI and the counterfeit division, they don't study, 500,000 counterfeit bills. They study the true one inside and out, so that, and you know this, but so that the moment someone just flashes something in front of them, like, that's fake. How in the world could you see that? Because I know it so well that that's it. And when you can understand, like even our Lord says, you have to be able to understand who your enemy and weigh that into your decisions. Once you understand how the enemy works and this great reset, and it is somewhat complicated because they want it that way, but once you crack that, you know what to look for. So when some war breaks out, it's most like 99.9% didn't happen by chance. It's who do they want you to take? What side do they want you to take? But in the end, like you're saying, the victims are always right in the middle. The vulnerable are always there. And I think that's for Sheen, that was a big thing. He said one of the great crises, and we learned from King David, is the fact that he was the one who who was a big advocate of social justice. When Nathan the prophet comes to him and explains the story of how a man took the ewe lamb, of a man who had, it's all he had. And it meant everything. And then basically, took it. I think, I don't know if he killed it or not, but then David hears this story and he says, this is outrageous. That man should die for that. And then Nathan says, you are the man. And Sheen told the story. He says, because, he loved the social justice, but he neglected individual justice. And when we have that mindset, like Sheen said, we're doing the novena to Fulton Sheen right now because it ends on his feast day on the 9th. This second reflection from yesterday, he talks about for Protestants, Catholics, and Jews, since we share moral conduct more or less the same, we have to acknowledge that an attack against one is an attack against all. And we're being brainwashed to just choose sides, these collectivist sides, and we forget the millions that are there. And that, was it Stalin or was it Lenin who said that the death of one is a tragedy, the death of a million is a statistic? That's part of the brainwashing, is that we simply, like you're saying, we'll accept 20,000. or it's complicated. And we're used to these kinds of numbers now. But all you have to do is like go to your feed. This hits me, and I honestly, it's hard for me to go to it, but I'll make the effort at times, especially when it works its way to my millions of pop-ups, Facebook or Instagram. And I'll never forget the one image. The last one I saw before I left was, it looked like a building had collapsed from, obviously it was bombed or right nearby. And you could see all the trapped dead people there. But what caught my attention was the fact that so many of those were children. And then stuck out was like this pink dress. And I looked at that picture. I just broke down. I had to leave. And even now it's hard to talk about it, but like, that's my daughter. That's my son. It's somebody else's. And we don't think like that.
No.
So whether it's the Christians and the Muslims in Gaza and the genocide, if the same thing was happening and those are pictures of Jews, the outrage has to be the same.
The same.
And
I'll give you an example, Peter. When we were told, which I believed it, I get tricked again and again. They trick, when I was a young infantryman during the first Iraq War, remember when they told us the lie? They had the young girl go before Congress and say that Iraqi
the incubators.
Soldiers, killing babies in the incubators. Turned out that young girl went to Georgetown visitation, hadn't been to Kuwait in like 18 months, and they were all lies. I believed it. I'm a young infantryman longing to go to Iraq to just kill as many Iraqis as I could. I mean, I had bloodlust. Who can go into a hospital and kill babies in incubators? We were told that Hamas killed, decapitated, and burned 40 children or whatever the number was. Completely fabrication. Complete lie. I believed it when I heard it. I believed it. I was enraged. I had friends in the press call me saying, Jason, don't share it. It's not true. And I'm like, how could it not be true? Who would lie like, I fell for it. But I still hear people today will say, what about the 40 babies? I'm like, yeah, I was very mad about the 40 babies. Turned out they didn't exist. But what about the 20,000 dead Palestinian children and the 40,000 missing? They're not going to be found. They're probably upwards of 60, 70,000 dead Palestinian children. No one wants to say it. But the number no one can deny is there are 20,000 plus dead Palestinian corpses that have been recovered. Yeah, I would be equally upset. And people have told me that's anti-Semitic, that I would be as upset as a Palestinian baby as a Jewish child. I'm like, are you nuts? I will be as upset if it's a child in New York, if it's a child in Tel Aviv, if it's a child in Gaza. But what adds injury to insult is when it's our taxpayer dollars and our weapon systems manufactured by American companies. Well, then it stings more. And people will say, why all the talk about Gaza, not other countries? Well, I tell you what, when other countries receive billions of dollars in U.S. aid for weapon systems that they then use to kill civilians, I'll be as enraged. Mm-hmm. And but this is the grace of being a Catholic. It's not normal to care, to love your quote unquote enemy. And we've been told that the Palestinians are our enemy since we were little kids. I mean, you think every movie I watched, I was a Chuck Norris, I love the martial arts movies. It seems like every Chuck Norris movie was like he was fighting Arabs, these clownish presentations of Arabs. It was just buffoonery. And, but when you think there have been 20,000 Arab civilians killed in wars in the Middle East that were launched by the West, 20 million. 20 million civilian casualties. That's just really unbelievable. And yet we say they're the violent ones. That's comforting, I guess. When what is our military budget is 7 times all the countries in the world combined, I think. Something like that. You look at Gaza, these are just 50% of Gaza are children.
Yeah.
50%.
Mm.
And there is a thoughtlessness, right? Have you noticed people just really seem indifferent to the suffering of the Palestinians? Well, Hamas did this, therefore whatever. Is that really how it goes? Is that how the world works?
No.
That's how the world works if you're a pagan, but that's not how the world works if you're a Christian.
Yeah.
But this is
Well,
it.
my
The
goodness.
world,
Yeah.
the world is getting dark. My first book that came out in 2014 was called The Race to Save Our Century. Actually, I had 60 pages edited out because they thought I was obsessing on Ukraine and Russia. You can get the book. You can look at the trailer. This book that came out in 2014, I said that the genocides and wars in the next 100 years, from 2014 forward for 100 years, will be greater than the genocides from 2014 to 1914. From start of World War I to 2014, that's why I wanted to come out on the anniversary of World War I. People chuckled. I silently thought I was paranoid. But since 2014, we had the rise of ISIS and the genocide of the Yazidis and the Christians in Iraq and Syria. We had the Uyghur genocide, 3 million Uyghurs in concentration camps today. We had the Russia invasion of Ukraine. And we're on the brink of World War III, like in 3 different points. So you know, as we speak, as I was talking to you, I'm getting updates from my team. South Korea is now on the brink of civil war.
Yeah,
They just
martial
martial law, and the Islamist groups in Aleppo have now emptied out the prisons, and the prisoners are running loose on the street, brutalizing civilians and looting. This is happening right now as we speak.
So for those that are watching this, obviously I'm for many, even those who are, tuned in, these conversations just don't really take place, especially among two Catholics. Um, and I'm sure that there's a lot of silence and pondering of these things. How can Catholics right now take action on, I mean, this is multi-levels. You have what you're doing, the Vulnerable People Project, right, are on the ground, the true heroes of our time. I know you refer to yourself as a mere concierge of that, but no, I mean, somebody has to do it, and you're also on the ground, so you're in that mix for sure. But there's so many different ways that this has to be approached. There's the human dimension, like Fulton Sheen. Like I could hear him, even his voice now, when he was talking about communism, and he said, "Free these people, free them." Like that was our responsibility. Free these people. I think of sex trafficking of children. We pray for it every morning in our Sheen Rosary. And that way I always pray, rescue these kids now. They're living in absolute hell. Please, like somebody raised in the army. Like, how do people get involved in that element? There's the poor, of course, the other dimension that will always and must underlie, even those who are doing it, the prayer element to give the power and the strength to endure what you're going to see and experience and be able to see them and everyone somehow, through the image of God, that they're everyone. These are people made in the image of God. And then you have those who have, the fight of we have to change the course that is allowing for all the money to flow into this trillions of dollars. I mean, like, if that's not stopped, it'll still happen. And so it's like it's over an overwhelming picture. But I think if people are watching this right now, that they're meant to do something about it. How can you simplify the actions that they could start taking right now?
Yeah, well, we're blessed. Our Lady gave us sort of the simple formula through prayer and penance. We can bring about peace in this world. So that's something we should all do. And as Catholics, we're unique in the Orthodox and the Apostolic churches, and our commitment to penance. Half the Christian world no longer even would know what the word penance means. So through prayer and penance, we have a website called ceasefirenow.org, ceasefirenow.org, and I will be presenting President Trump with a petition. We're asking everyone to sign it, that we want an immediate ceasefires in Ukraine and Gaza. We need to bring these wars to an end. enough is enough. And President Trump promised us this. And this is what he wants. But we have to know, have you ever had, you've ever been a boss and you're happy when someone complains about something because it gives you an opportunity as a supervisor to address it?
Hmm.
Sometimes you need someone beneath you to like complain and complain and complain. And then you say, well, are you listening to what they're saying? I think we need to look at this. Trump has surrounded himself with a lot of hawks and that are uber committed to these wars, Marco Rubio being top of that list. And so we need to be very clear to President Trump that the foundation of MAGA is America first. That doesn't mean like we hate the world. No, we've been burdening the world with these regime change wars. Our wars in the Middle East flooded Europe with migrants from Syria. We shattered Syria, flooding Europe with migrants. We shattered Iraq in Afghanistan, flooding Europe with migrants, leading to all sorts of social problems, not just obviously for the Europeans, but for the poor migrants that are displaced, lost, and confused, and bewildered and traumatized. So enough of these wars. That's how Trump launched his political career, standing up to the neoconservatives. But I've been watching so many people that call themselves MAGA sounding like Dick Cheney all of a sudden. And so, prayer and penance, and let's not get swept away by enthusiasm. I've opposed every major war we've had in my adult life, except for the first Iraq war when I was a soldier. And every time it's like you're spinning in the wind. Then after the war, everyone's like, yeah, I agreed with you. Yeah, no, you didn't. No, you didn't. It's easy to oppose the last dumb war. It's always hard to oppose the next dumb war and stand up to the present dumb war. So let's end these wars in the Middle East in a way that ensures the security of everyone. The best way to secure the security of people is peace, not continuation of war. And the same thing with Ukraine, and don't think there aren't going to be curveballs thrown at President Trump. So he needs us to hold the line and say, President Trump, you promised us ceasefires. We demand ceasefires. And no one's in a better position to demand this than us as conservatives. I mean, I'm assuming I'm conservative, voted for Trump, campaigned for Trump. And I think that puts me in a very good position to write articles and speak out and demand peace.
Is there something that exists already that we can get behind that gives that one particular effort the voice and the megaphone that it needs? You could have a lot of individual voices, and then you could have a million-man march on Washington. It's like, whoa, whatever that cause is, there's a lot of people there for that. Is there somebody or maybe that's the goal of what you're doing in this next initiative, but that can make that voice loud very quickly? Because until that happens, there's enough people to damper they would see it as complaints from here and there, versus since most of the media and influencers and the influencers who should be vocal on this aren't, where do we really go so that voice can be heard? I mean, you do an open letter. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah,
So
go to ceasefirenow.org. I'm going to write an open letter where I make it clear to President Trump that he will be remembered as the president that saved the Christians of the Holy Land, or he will be remembered as the man who was president when the Christians of the Holy Land were ethnically cleansed. This probably, naturally speaking, will be the last Christian Christmas in northern Gaza, where the oldest Christian community in the world lives, that was planted by St. James, the cousin of Jesus.
Excuse me.
Be the last Christmas in the West Bank. We need to have courage in our conversations with our family and our friends and on social media. I have noticed more and more Catholic influencers speaking up in defense of the Christians in Gaza. It's taken them 12 months, but they had to put their toe in the water. They had to put their finger in the air. And now, okay, the water seems like it's safe to get in. The more of us that speak up, the safer it is for others to speak up. It takes courage to do it early. At the end, it takes no courage. We're at that point where it's taking little courage. In fact, I'd have to say, I think that the genocide is inescapable, as you've said earlier, that no one really challenges me publicly at all. At all. I mean, never. I would love for that. They whisper and they slink around and they run their little influence campaigns. But the reality is, at this point, you have to be pretty ignorant not to recognize there's an ethnic cleansing going on. And many people who acknowledge there's an ethnic cleansing, they hold to a very extreme Christian Zionism that thinks that God wants them to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians. They will say that they are the Philistines, and God is punishing them through Hamas because they have not eradicated those people from the land, which is quite ignorant, because these people are not Philistines. They're monotheists. They're Christians and Muslims. They don't sacrifice children. Israel has legal abortion as the largest per capita exporter of fetal tissue. The largest, I think, gay pride parade in the world is in Tel Aviv. So if we're looking for candidates for the Philistines, but there are those who advocate that acknowledge it's a genocide and think that God's commanding it. And I know there are people watching the show inevitably because of their consumption of evangelical propaganda hold to that belief. And it's a strongly held belief because they have been indoctrinated for decades. It's sad to think that somebody can receive the Eucharist and advocate the ethnic cleansing of Catholics from a community founded by St. James. Wow. Think about that for a while, guys.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I was teasing. I got a nasty email from somebody early on. I read it to my wife. I said, yeah, I'll take that, because I know when I stand before St. Peter, if they let me in, maybe after a long time in purgatory, I think the apostles will high five me. You were the guy like bringing food into my cousins. Thank you. Hey, this is the guy that brought St. James. Peter, come here. Andrew, come here. This is the guy that was bringing trucks into Gaza. Yeah, Knuckles. I'll take that. I don't want to be the guy that was on Twitter advocating the ethnic cleansing of the apostles' families. I tell my evangelical friends, like, you think St. James is Jesus' brother. They're slaughtering the descendants of St. James's family. It's just facts. Yeah, I don't want to be there. I don't want to be in those guys' shoes.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't want to be in the shoes on Judgment Day of people advocating the slaughter of Muslims, Yazidis, Jews, Hindus, anyone. Our job is not to slaughter them, it's to evangelize the world. And when they make themselves our enemy, to continue to love them. And if we find ourselves in positions of leadership in our political community, where we have the rightful authority, not only the authority, but the duty to defend our community through the use of violence, through the military, we do so in a way that is just, noble. We don't target civilians. We don't use starvation as a weapon of war. We don't advocate genocide and ethnic cleansing. That's all.
Yeah.
Sorry, today's show is depressing, but you caught me on a day where
Well, that's why I have you on, actually, is because it's you've anticipated about 90% of the things I would have asked questions on, so I just let you go. It's probably the most silent I've ever been, which is a good thing as a podcast host, is to let the guest speak. But I think you really paint a picture for all of us to be thinking about, because, like you said too, one thing everyone can do is, and we must be doing, is what our Blessed Mother directly asks, like Fatima, pray the Rosary every single day for peace and an end to war. That's a given. Like, if you're not doing that, you better start right now. The other things too, fasting. We've been talking. Certain demons can only be cast out by prayer and by fasting. So the power is always there, but the work that still needs to be done is the other part of it. It's we're not monks. We're not in religious communities. We're the lay people of the world. And what did Fulton Sheen say? He's like, who's going to save the church? And I'd say, who's going to save through that the world? It's going to be us. And one of the crises we have, I think, is also with, we don't have enough Catholic men who stand up and assume the responsibilities of leadership that they should be having, whether it could be in the home, but that translates in every other aspect of what they're doing. We got a lot of smart people in the church, but what good is that if it's not actually there to win what Sheen would say is the revolution? He says, what's going to exist after these wars stop? He says you have to understand the difference between the war and the revolution, the philosophies of life, the ideologies that remain. Because if you don't fix that, if you don't uproot what's actually behind the Great Reset, because it's driven by a demonic, satanic philosophy, anti-God, anti-human, anti-family, anti-gender, you name it. It's all transhumanism. If you don't understand that and fight against that, then you will ultimately lose and be the victims of that. And so where are these people? If people say, what can they do? They should be engaged in this. Otherwise, they don't even realize that they're in a war. And I think the judgment on neglect is going to be perhaps bigger than anything else. As I knew about these things and I really did nothing because I was afraid. Like you said, if you're afraid of one label, you'll be afraid of any of them. And so pray, get involved. If you are on that level, we have to be able to reclaim these things. If you're close to JD Vance, get in his darn ear and be whispering these things every single second. Where's the positive infiltration that we need? That's what I'm always asking. And then, of course, there's helping those who are on the ground. Go to vulnerablepeopleproject.org, right? Or .com. .com. I always make that mistake. Yeah, vulnerablepeopleproject.com. Is it also VPP.com?
No.
Okay.
Vulnerablepeopleproject.com, or you could go to GazaChristians.com.
Okay.
Or ceasefirenow.org. These are our sites.
Go there and you'll see right away what your contributions and your donations are going to actually go into helping. And it's personally, when I look at that, it's like, how can I not help at this particular thing? I can, I mean, okay, I wasted money. Maybe a few bottles of wine. I'm like, shoot, when I see Jason's, spelling out that $100 will, give X amount of meals to like 30 people. I'm like, how can I not? And
give you an example, brother. Like one example, for $250 a month, that's what it costs us to secure a church in Nigeria from Islamist extremism. So people donate $250 a month. Whenever I get a $250 a month monthly donor, I get to add a parish. And then when you go to our website, you can see the parishes that we secure from Islamist violence in Nigeria, where Catholics are facing priests are being kidnapped all of the time. And I want to say one thing, Peter. I want to be clear on this. When I was a young pro-lifer, I had a rule. And when I was a college student, I didn't want to thrust abortion into every conversation, which I was prone to do, So I made a rule that I would say to my family or friends. They would always sit me down. I'm sure most of you have had this conversation. Like, don't argue with Jehovah's Witness cousin Betty, Don't argue with pro-choice Uncle Frank, Okay. But I had a rule that I would say I won't. But if they insult the Catholic Church, I will defend the church. And if they will say something that undermines the dignity of the child in the womb, I will defend the child in the womb's dignity. And that's just a rule that I have. And I would say it's my rule now. I've been speaking up against the state of Israel's abuses of the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank and the crimes they've committed in Lebanon against Christians. I will never let anyone undermine a Palestinian or an Arab in my presence. But people have heard me defending the Palestinians and the Arabs. I've had people come up to me and go, let me tell you about the Jews, buddy. I don't let them do that either. Don't let them do that either. And I think that that's just a good place for us as Catholics to begin. Let's always advocate for the dignity of the human person. Never let people in our presence undermine the dignity of the human person. And that should be well, now, to be honest, I probably wreck most Christmases because I will argue with Jehovah's Witness cousin and
excuse me,
pro-choice uncle. But I have a rule. I'm not good at sticking to the rule, but I do have a rule.
Well, that's important because it goes back to the heart of what we do here and really what Sheen said. He says, and I use this ad nausea, is right if nobody's right. Wrong is wrong, even if everybody is wrong. He says, and in this error-infested world, what we really need is a church and an authority that is right. Not right when the world is right, but one that is right when the world is wrong. And I think that's exactly what you're keeping to. It doesn't, right and wrong aren't on sides. They're not on labels. They're not in countries. It is supersedes all of that. And I think that's what, with what you're doing in the Vulnerable People Project, is something everybody should get behind. If you've never heard of them, if you've never supported them, I'm going to make one challenge. Everybody who's watching this right now, just to make one thing that supports them one time. Hopefully it'll be more, but just do it now. And just think of what Jason said. You can't calculate the reward that is given through that. Not like we do things for that purpose, but to know that, it's, if you can identify with the vulnerable, then everyone's, you see everybody as your wife, as your child, as your daughter, your son, and that changes everything. So anyway, that's my challenge to everybody, especially here during the season of Advent, as we prepare for the coming of the Lord and our Blessed Mother. Let's make sure the vulnerable have a room at the inn. Let's do that, especially in Bethlehem. I mean, how stark is that to even think that we're back there. So on that note, Jason, I want to thank you so much for your time, for sharing all that you did. I love it because it's what we need to hear. And you did extremely well being having pneumonia. I'm getting over something, and it's not even that, and I'm like coughing all throughout. So thanks for bearing that, and know that you have our prayers, you have our support, and anytime you need to get a message through, of course, you always have a platform here. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you, brother. You're one of my favorite apostolates. I don't know if you notice, I share every meme you guys create, and you guys do a great job. And the world needs Fulton Sheen. And I do have pneumonia, but I have the cure for pneumonia. It's just you keep drinking coffee till you can do a podcast, and then sometimes you over caffeinate and you don't let the podcast host get one word in. And I'm afraid I might have done that, but it's hard to know the balance.
You're on to speak, not me. So it's awesome. All right, brother. Well, thank you so much. And if I don't talk to you before Christmas on the 25th, have a very blessed Christmas and your family as well. May God continue to bless everything that you're doing with the Vulnerable People Project, and bless your book that everybody needs to get right now.
Great Christmas present.
The great campaign against the Great Reset.
Last week was up in the top 100 books again for a couple hours. I love watching how it fluctuates. So
yeah, it looks like it's I don't know if it's an easy read, but it's only like 6 hours on Audible. It actually tells you the time. I'm like, so 6 hours, you can be totally red pilled if you don't know anything about it.
I talk about that in my book. I say we don't want to be red pilled or white pilled. That's Gnosticism. We smack the pills out their hand. No pills for us. Gnosticism. I have a whole chapter on Gnosticism, victimism, transhumanism. I have the ideologies that's used by the mystical body of Antichrist to amass power and abuse the vulnerable. Gnosticism is foundational. Victim is sort of the key. But I list the ideologies of evil that are the instruments used by the that are the instruments of the mystical body of Antichrist.
Powerful stuff. Well, get your hands on it. Let some light reading for Christmas. As a matter of fact, read it around the table with your family.
Yeah, throw out all the rest of your books and just read your book every day forever. Except the Bible. I think we're all right,
brother. Well, we're going to cough ourselves out of this episode, and I wish you all the best. God bless, brother.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Right is right if nobody is right. Wrong is wrong if everybody is wrong. And believe me, in this error-infested world, what we really need is a church and an authority that is right not when the world is right, but one that is right when the world is wrong.
Never in history has the prayer of the Rosary been more needed to save our families, our countries, and defeat the evils of the world than now. The Fulton Sheen Institute worked closely with the Roma Rosary to develop the most unique, beautiful, and meaningful rosary that was inspired by Fulton Sheen's World Mission Rosary. This special handcrafted rosary continues Sheen's passion to support the mission of the Church to evangelize the entire world. Each decade of the rosary has a different color, which corresponds with a different continent. Yellow for Asia, red for the Americas, white for Europe, blue for the nations of Oceania, and green for Africa. Each Fulton Sheen Aroma Rosary comes with a set of 4 pure essential oil blends that have been chosen for their therapeutic and theological significance. These blends correspond to the 4 mysteries of the Rosary. Simply choose the oil for the mystery of the day, drop a small drop in the palm of your hand, and massage the oil over the surface, being sure to catch the lava beads. You're good to go, and your prayer will linger longer with these beautiful aromatic notes. Every Fulton Sheen Aroma Rosary you purchase supports our mission to fight the battle for the hearts and souls of the Christian family and lead our world back to God. So visit the Fulton Sheen Institute's store and pick up your beautiful Fulton Sheen Aroma Rosary today. Get one for you, your family members, and your close friends, and don't forget your pastor. Thank you so much for your prayers and your support.